Hello again, 102. In this video, I will go over some of the different factors and topics from Chapter 19, Seizing an American Empire, and I will do a series of videos on this. This is a very important chapter, and you need to be familiar with many of the ideas that go on in this chapter because we will be dealing with it for most of the 20th century. Historically, Americans were isolationists, but by the late 19th century, the old idea of manifest destiny from the 1840s, where it was believed that it was the destiny or the idea that God had said that we were going to expand our territory westward all the way across the continent, now they will use that idea to justify expanding American control over other regions of the Western Hemisphere and even in the Pacific and Asia. So this is one factor that motivates the new imperialism after the Civil War. The new manifest destiny, in other words, became a justification for imperialism. For the United States to survive and prosper, expansionists argued that we had to keep pushing beyond our borders. Frederick Jackson Turner, famous historian from the University of Wisconsin, said that the frontier was closed, his famous frontier thesis in 1893. Therefore, we need new frontiers in which to exercise our expansive character and to spread democratic ideals and Christian beliefs. More on Turner in that thesis in later chapters. Imperialism defined, it's the use of diplomatic or military force to extend the nation's power and enhance its economic interests, often by acquiring territory or colonies and justifying such behavior with assumptions of racial superiority. In practical terms, prominent political and business leaders argued that our development required new territories for raw materials such as these and to open up new markets because domestic markets within the mainland United States had become saturated and they weren't expanding or growing anymore. And that's always a problem in the capitalist system, ladies and gentlemen. Without growth, stagnation eventually sets in and profits fall and then wealth begins to decline. And along with new markets and sources of raw materials, this Navy then that's going to help deliver these products to all these far-flung places are going to need bases where they can replenish supplies of coal and water. And this idea of imperialism has already been going on by the Western European powers long before the United States got into this game. All of these different countries had conquered most of Africa and Asia. And especially in Africa, the Europeans are competing with themselves because they don't want one of the other Western European powers to take this area over before they do. The British especially were very interested in exploiting the raw materials of South Africa, where vast quantities of diamonds and gold were discovered, and they were interested in building the Cape Town to Cairo, Egypt railroad. Unfortunately, the Belgians and the Germans got in their way. And another reason for this new imperialism will be the white man's burden to convert these conquered peoples to Christianity. And by 1900, there's 18,000 Protestant and Catholic evangelicals scattered around the world. A huge influence on the intellectual elites of the 19th century was Alfred Thayer Mahan's book, where he's basically analyzing Great Britain. And he concluded that without a great navy, a nation cannot become great. And this book really influenced Theodore Roosevelt. And this is a Harvard professor, John Fiske. And this is another factor for new imperialism, is the idea of Anglo-Saxon superiority. It's social Darwinism, ladies and gentlemen. The idea that only the strongest races survive. So in order to show your superiority, you must conquer other peoples. And this is then proof that you are a superior nation. And most of the technologically advanced countries of the 19th century will be heavily influenced by the idea of social Darwinism, which comes from Charles Darwin's biological studies of natural selection. So that leads into the second question then of how and why America expanded its influence in the Pacific before the War of 1898. So again, to quickly summarize, the factors that motivated New Manifest Destiny: new markets and sources of raw materials, the need for bases for this newly developed ocean-going navy, imperialism as practiced by the other advanced countries of the world, and the idea of Anglo-Saxon superiority. William H. Seward was Secretary of State under Lincoln, and after his death in the Johnson administration in 1867, he is very, very interested in getting rid of all of the European powers from the Pacific coast. And he's interested basically in acquiring the entire Pacific coast all the way up to the North Pole. And in 1867, he succeeded in acquiring Alaska from the Russians, who needed the cash. And this was one of the biggest bonanzas in American history, the biggest gain since the Louisiana Purchase, all for $7.2 million. Laughed at the time, but it's later, when all the gold and oil is discovered, what a deal that was. At the time, it's mocked out. Here's going to be our new senators. This is kind of a bigoted cartoon as well, right? We're going to have penguin senators and Eskimos. But it's certainly paid off in the 20th century. Next, we will eventually acquire Hawaii. It was a unified kingdom since the late 18th century, and there is a huge missionary population there. And those that are there in commerce are engaged in the sugarcane business, also pineapples. And they had signed a trade agreement with the U.S. in 1875, and all that Hawaiian sugar enters the United States duty-free, tariff-free, in exchange for Hawaii's promise that none of its territory would be leased or granted to another nation. And the sugarcane business booms with the importation of cheap Chinese and Japanese labor. And these American sugar planters became very, very influential and very, very wealthy. And eventually, the native Hawaiian population begins to suffer, and their fortunes are declining. So when the queen comes in, Liliuokalani, she believes in the policy of Hawaiian Islands for the Hawaiians, and she begins to implement that. But she is thwarted by the Haoles, who are now pushing for annexation by the United States. And the Haoles eventually will form a force, and they're supported by the U.S. ambassador, who brought in Marines to support a coup that took place in 1893, and the Queen surrendered to the superior military forces. And before Harrison left office, he sent an annexation treaty to the Senate. But President Cleveland does not want this because the Hawaiians don't support annexation. But the Haoles are resisting, and they form their own republic with a provision in the Constitution for American annexation, and that's going to end up happening by the end of the decade. And there was much protesting about this because they never gave their consent for this annexation. And the Spanish-American War, or the War of 1898, will then expand our interests in the Pacific and Asia even further.